Tian Taylor never imagined that her life would get tangled in a fabricated romance. As an ordinary secretary, she was used to long, hectic days working for Alan Harrington, the cold and ruthless CEO of Harrington Enterprises, a man who didn't believe in love. Everything changed when Alan's family started pressuring him into marrying Linda Montgomery, the daughter of an influential family. Linda adored Alan, but he had never once reciprocated her feelings. He refused to let himself be tied down by a marriage he didn't want. One morning at the office, Alan made Tian an offer that left her speechless. Pretend to be his girlfriend for 3 months. At first, she flat out refused. The idea of faking a relationship with her boss sounded utterly ridiculous. But then, Alan named his price, a sum so large it could solve all of her financial troubles and help her family. Tian hesitated. The logical part of her mind screamed at her to refuse. This was reckless, absurd. But then she thought of her family, of the financial burden weighing her down. Could she really afford to walk away from this? With a deep sigh, she finally met Alan's gaze and nodded. After all, it was just a contract, wasn't it? A game. A role she had to play for 3 months. What she didn't know was that this simple arrangement would change her life forever. 3 days later, Tian stood still in front of the grand mirror in a luxurious dressing room of a 5-star hotel, her fingers gripping the soft fabric of her gown. The navy blue evening dress hugged her figure perfectly, exuding elegance, yet making her feel strangely out of place. She had never worn something so lavish before. Her hair was pulled into a graceful updo, with a few delicate curls framing her face, adding to her gentle features. But no matter how much she adjusted her posture, she couldn't shake the unease pooling in her stomach. "It's just a role," Tian reminded herself, taking a deep breath to steady her nerves. A knock on the door pulled her out of her thoughts. She turned, only to find Alan Harrington standing at the doorway. Dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, he looked every bit as powerful and commanding as always. His sharp gaze swept over her, lingering for a brief moment before flickering with something unspoken. Approval? But just as quickly it vanished. "Not bad," he remarked coolly. Tian folded her arms, raising a brow. "Is that a compliment or just an evaluation?" Alan smirked but didn't respond. Instead, he extended his hand. "Let's go." The evening gala was held at the Harrington estate, a dazzling mansion illuminated by golden chandeliers, filled with business moguls, politicians, and the elite. As soon as Alan and Tian stepped inside, all eyes turned toward them. A wave of hushed whispers spread through the room. "Who is she? Alan never brings a date." The scrutinizing stares felt like a spotlight burning into Tian's skin, but she kept a poised smile. This was just a contract, just a role she had to play for 3 months. Yet, no matter how much she reassured herself, an unsettling feeling gnawed at her. Especially when her eyes landed on a woman standing across the room, staring at them intently. Linda Montgomery, the woman Alan's family wanted him to marry. She was draped in an elegant crimson gown, her golden hair tied back in a sleek ponytail, her face flawless. But what stood out the most was the look in her eyes. Shock, suspicion, and hurt. Alan's grip on Tian's hand suddenly tightened, startling her. When she glanced up at him, she realized his gaze was locked onto Linda. A strange tightness coiled in Tian's chest, something she refused to acknowledge. Why did it feel like she was intruding on something private? Like she was just a temporary replacement in someone else's unfinished love story? The weight of the room's attention pressed on her shoulders, but none of it mattered, not when Alan's gaze lingered on Linda a second too long. A sense of unease curled around her heart. She was just a pawn in this game, wasn't she? Tian lost track of how many circles they had made around the room, how many hands they had shaken, how many polite smiles they had exchanged. But through it all, Linda never took her eyes off them. She was waiting, and Tian knew it was only a matter of time before the confrontation came. As Alan spoke with a business associate, Linda finally approached them, her smile poised and graceful. But her eyes, sharp and unwavering, made Tian feel like she was being examined under a microscope. "Alan, aren't you going to introduce me to your girlfriend?" Linda's voice was sweet, yet there was a quiet challenge beneath her words. Alan didn't hesitate. He tightened his grip on Tien's hand and turned toward Linda. "This is Tien Taylor, my girlfriend." Tien's heart skipped a beat. "My girlfriend." She knew this was coming. They had rehearsed this response, she was prepared. But hearing Alan say it aloud, in front of Linda, in front of an entire audience, made it feel dangerously real. Linda's smile remained, but it no longer held warmth. "Really? That's surprising, because you once told me you didn't believe in love." A few heads turned at Linda's remark, but Alan remained unshaken. "Things change." "Do they?" Linda took another step forward, her piercing gaze locked onto Tien's. "Then prove it." Tien frowned. "What do you mean?" Linda tilted her head slightly, her lips curling into something almost predatory. "If you truly love each other, you shouldn't have any problem showing it. A kiss, perhaps?" The air grew thick with tension. Tien stiffened, instinctively looking at Alan. She expected him to react, maybe refuse, maybe dismiss Linda's challenge, but instead, he calmly set down his glass of wine and turned to her. "What do you think, Tien?" His voice was deep, steady, so unnervingly composed that it sent a shiver down her spine. She opened her mouth, but before she could even process what was happening, Alan had already pulled her into his arms. Then came the kiss, swift, unexpected, and overwhelming. Tien's breath hitched, her entire body freezing as Alan's lips met hers. The world around them blurred, the murmurs of the crowd fading into a distant hum. This wasn't just a staged act, it was something else, something that sent a pulse of warmth through her veins. Her heart pounded wildly, confusion and something far more dangerous creeping in. Was this still part of the game, or had the rules already changed? She had no idea how to respond. But her heart betrayed her effortlessly, pounding wildly against her ribcage, as if trying to break free. When Alan finally pulled away, Tien was still struggling to steady her breath. He turned back to Linda, his voice calm and unwavering. "Satisfied now?" Linda pressed her lips together, her hands curling slightly at her sides, but she merely let out a quiet scoff. "Perhaps, but I still don't believe you actually love her." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Tien standing there, her emotions in complete turmoil. She knew this was all an act, a contract, a game. So why did her heart feel like it was playing by different rules? Tien thought that after that night, everything would return to normal, that she and Alan would continue playing their roles until the contract ended. But she was wrong. Alan had changed. She wasn't sure when exactly it started. Maybe it was the moment he pulled her into that kiss in front of Linda. Maybe it was the way he looked at her afterward. Something deeper, something real, something that didn't feel like an act. But the one thing she was sure of was this: Alan no longer kept his distance from her. Before, when they were alone, Alan always maintained a professional barrier between them. But now, he didn't. Whenever they were in public, his hand would hold hers tighter than necessary. Whenever they walked through a crowd, his arm would settle on her waist, pulling her closer. Even when no one was watching, Alan hadn't changed. One afternoon, as Tien was sorting documents in his office, Alan stepped in and stood beside her, too close. She could feel the warmth of his presence, the steady rhythm of his breath. Frowning, she turned to him. "What are you doing?" Alan didn't answer. His gaze lingered on her face longer than usual, as if he was trying to figure something out, something even he didn't fully understand. It was strange. He was still Alan, cold, rational, someone who didn't believe in love, wasn't he? So why did she feel like he actually cared? Linda, of course, didn't back down so easily. A few days later, she walked into Alan's office without warning. "We need to talk," she declared, her piercing gaze flickering briefly toward Tien before settling on Alan. Tien immediately sensed the tension. She was about to excuse herself, but Alan's hand suddenly caught hers, stopping her from leaving. "I don't think there's anything left to say, Linda," Alan said coolly, his tone sharper than usual. Linda let out a quiet scoff. "Is that so? Do you really expect me to believe that you love her? Tien tensed, but she said nothing. This wasn't her battle to fight. Linda took a step forward, her voice dropping into a taunting whisper. Alan Harrington has never believed in love. So why now? Why the sudden change? Or, she tilted her head, her eyes gleaming with something dangerously sharp. Is this all just an act? Tien's heart pounded in her chest. She stole a glance at Alan, waiting for his reaction. But Alan didn't flinch. He didn't waver. Instead, he met Linda's gaze head-on and said, If this were an act, do you think I'd let you figure it out so easily? Linda faltered for a split second, and Tien felt her breath catch in her throat. Because that answer wasn't a denial. It wasn't a confirmation either. It was just enough to leave her completely lost in the unknown. And for the first time, she started to wonder, was she still just a part of this act, or had she become something more? Tien couldn't keep doing this. Ever since the confrontation with Linda, things between her and Alan had become unbearably unclear. The way he looked at her, the way he touched her, the way he protected her, was it all just part of their contract, or had it become something more? She needed answers. That evening, Alan hosted a grand party to announce his company's latest project. Tien played her part flawlessly, smiling, holding his arm, nodding at important guests. But inside, she felt suffocated. Everything inside her was building up, and she knew if she didn't say something now, she never would. So the moment the party ended, she grabbed Alan's hand and pulled him away from the crowd, leading him to the rooftop where they could be alone. What are you doing? Alan asked, frowning at her urgency. Tien took a deep breath, clenching her fists. This contract, it has to end. Alan froze. What are you talking about? She lifted her gaze to meet his, her expression uncertain but her voice unwavering. I can't keep pretending anymore, Alan. I've fallen in love with you. Silence. Alan didn't speak. He didn't react immediately. He just stared at her, his stormy gray eyes reflecting emotions she couldn't decipher. Tien let out a quiet laugh, though it was filled with sorrow. But I don't know if anything you've done was ever real. She exhaled shakily. If this was all just a game to you, then I'm sorry, I can't do this anymore. She turned to leave, but before she could take a step, a firm hand wrapped around her wrist, stopping her in place. Wait, Alan said, his voice lower than she'd ever heard it. Tien clenched her hands into fists, refusing to look at him. Let me go, Alan. No. She bit her lip, her eyes stinging. Why? Alan's jaw tightened. She could see him fighting with himself. And then, after a long pause, he let out a small, bitter laugh. Alan ran a hand through his hair, exhaling sharply. Damn it, Tien! He looked away for a moment as if battling something within himself. When he finally met her gaze again, his voice was quieter, almost vulnerable. I never thought I would love anyone. His fingers curled into fists. When I made this proposal, it was just a plan, a contract, a game with an expiration date. He let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. But there was one thing I didn't plan for. I didn't plan to fall in love with you. Tien stood frozen. Her heart pounded in her chest, but this time it wasn't from confusion or doubt. It was from the weight of Alan's words shaking her to the core. He had fallen in love with her. She searched his eyes, looking for any trace of deception, but there was none. No more barriers, no more contracts, no more necessary lies to keep up the act. Only truth. Alan slowly lifted his hand, his fingers brushing against her cheek as he murmured, I love you, Tien, and this time, there's no contract. She didn't know who moved first, but the next moment their lips met. Gone were the staged kisses, gone were the watching eyes. It was just them and the love they had finally admitted. Tien walked down a flower-lined path in the gardens of the Harrington estate, her heart racing as she saw Alan waiting at the end of the aisle. Dressed in a sharp black suit, he was no longer the cold, untouchable CEO he used to be. He was a man who had chosen love over strategy. As she reached him, Alan took her hand firmly in his, leaning in to whisper, I told you I was never going to let you go. Tien smiled, whispering back, and I never wanted to leave. As they exchanged their vows, Alan leaned in close, his breath warm against her ear as he murmured, "I love you." And this time there was no contract, no pretense, only real love. A year after their wedding, life for Tian and Alan was still filled with happiness, but in a way neither of them had expected. Tian never thought that the cold, arrogant Alan Harrington could turn into such a thoughtful husband, but he proved her wrong. Every morning, Alan was the first to wake up, but instead of diving straight into work, he would take a few moments to simply watch his wife sleep, sometimes brushing a stray curl from her face. On lazy weekend mornings, he would bring her coffee in bed, occasionally even making breakfast just to see her sleepy smile. Of course, not everything was perfect. Alan was still a strong-willed CEO, and Tian had never been one to back down from an argument. But instead of tense battles like before, their disagreements now ended with a kiss, a sincere apology, or a tight embrace. One breezy afternoon, as Tian watered the plants in their small garden, Alan approached her from behind, wrapping his arms around her waist. "You're going to overwater that," he murmured against her ear, a teasing smirk playing on his lips. Tian rolled her eyes but couldn't hide her smile. Before she could respond, Alan slipped something into her hand. A small, delicate bracelet with their initials engraved inside. "Just because," he said simply, pressing a soft kiss to her temple. "What are you doing?" she laughed, leaning back against him. He lowered his head, murmuring against her ear, "Just felt like holding my wife for a moment." Tian smiled, her heart full. They had come such a long way, from a fabricated contract to a love that was undeniably real, and now she knew she was standing beside the man who would love her for a lifetime.